I think it's about time that we ended up doing the next Trove Tier List video. So I gotta mention a couple things just before we get started. Firstly, it is double star bar week. So you definitely want to get your hands on your star bar because you can get your qubits for this, that, and the other thing. It being weekly reset means that we can get our astral echo tomes and stuff like that. And then also just one kind of behind the scenes thing to mention is I know that the videos have been quite inconsistent lately. Most of all, it was the long weekend and I wanted to spend a lot of extra time with my wife, okay? So that's basically the summary of it. So today we're gonna be tackling which class is the strongest in Trove. So the strongest class, the boss killer, as it were. And I think that generally speaking, a lot of you are going to agree with my tier list. Some classes you might not, but more importantly, some might be a surprise or two. I don't know, we'll see. So as usual, we're going to be going in linear order from the starting class all the way to the end, with your boy Solarion being the finale. The thing is, this is going to be a very strict parameter tier list because that's kind of what we like to do with these videos, or at least what I like to do with these videos, where we are specifically looking at a character's functionality as a boss killer. This holds no weight as far as the overall best class or the fastest class. We already have tier lists for those. And don't worry, we've got lots and lots of other tier lists that are going to be coming down the line. I've got tons of ideas, best classes for delves, best overall tank, so on and so forth. So let's get started. So the funny thing is that the knight isn't actually the worst as a boss killer. Like, I'd say he's maybe a C or a B, but I'm just gonna put him as a C anyways. Because for those of you that don't know, right now the knight actually has a pretty strong attack just holding his left click. None of his other abilities do anything, unfortunately. But more so, the knight is decent enough at a boss killer because he's got decent damage, not good, not great. But he's got a lot of survivability now just because of the fact that his shield can tank so much stuff. The pirate captain, however, I would say is probably a better boss killer. So there's a trick to the pirate captain that a lot of people don't really know. And that is the fact that when you end up consuming cooldown flasks, you can actually throw down multiple of your ult. There's not like a line of code that says he can only have one cannon out at a time. So what people used to actually do in Shadow Towers, especially I remember fighting like Pinata God and stuff like that in Ultra, is you would end up getting your pirate captain to throw down multiple of his ult turret, and it would just start stacking and stacking and stacking and stacking the damage. And back in the day, that was actually one of the faster classes that could end up fighting Dread. Just fun fact. Ice Sage we gotta throw into the S tier. Our first S tier of the day. I mean, technically it could go into the A tier, but I think we all know and agree that the Ice Sage is still a really, really solid boss killer. This was the top class that everybody ended up using before we ended up moving on to something a little more obvious. But Ice Sage, most of all, just has like such high amounts of damage and can have... There's a little bit of a trick. I'm not gonna pretend that I know how to do it, but there's a trick that you can end up doing before you end up activating the Leviathan that would end up like doing more damage than it should. Now, I hate to do this to your boy Shadowhunter, but obviously, I don't think I would consider Shadowhunter to be S tier. Shadowhunter is very, very competent at fighting a boss, but I don't think is going to end up being anyone's first choice. Like, you can use Shadowhunter as a boss killer in a group, and I don't think anyone's gonna bat an eyelash. Shadowhunter has, you know, stacking damage with its ultimate now, which does heaps and heaps and heaps and heaps of damage if it works. That's kind of my main problem with the Shadowhunter, is that its ult still suffers from a lot of hit detection issues, and even the stacking damage over time, or the dot, also suffers from a lot of hit detection issue, or at least it does for me. Anybody that's, you know, might disagree, again, you can sound off in the comments whether or not you think another class should be higher or lower on the list. Fae Trickster is a tough one. I could put it B or I could put it C, because the thing is, Fae Trickster is one of those classes that actually has some of the highest single target damage in the game. It's just that it can't output more than it's capable of, you know, if that makes sense. So it's like, Whereas a lot of other characters can stack and stack and stack all sorts of different abilities. Fae Trickster kind of just sits there with a steady, solid amount of damage. And unfortunately doesn't really get to shine until you end up seeing it fighting bosses. So maybe it could even go to a higher tier. Someone might disagree with me on this, but I'm gonna throw it into the B list just because it's, you know, it can handle a boss. It's just not going to do a great job of it versus some other characters that are a lot easier to solo bosses with. And Candy Barb is going to be our first D tier. Now, the thing is with the Candy Barb, the only reason you might see people using it while fighting a boss is because they're using the ultimate to increase the attack speed of everybody else in the party. That was kind of the big trick back in Shadow Tower days, is it would be a full group of gunslingers and then like one Candy Barb so that they could end up giving the attack speed to everybody else. But as far as just fighting a boss, I should also mention that in this list, we are specifically talking about like soloing a boss. And the reason why I say soloing a boss like a Leviathan is because if you can solo it, then chances are when you're in a group, it's going to be a lot better to just use that class. Like if you're soloing a Leviathan with an Ice Sage, chances are a whole group of Ice Sages is going to be better than say, oh, I'm in a group, so now the Candy Barb is useful, you know? Like Candy Barb still has its attack speed, but generally speaking, I would not say is a boss killer. Same with the Neo Ninja. I think a lot of Neo Ninja mains are starting to slowly feel the pressure, because while Neo Ninja has the fastest movement speed in the game, the damage is slowly starting to fall off as other characters end up getting more and more buffs, which is ironic because the Neo Ninja was actually one of the strongest classes at one point just because they kept buffing its shuriken despite the fact that they weren't buffing every other character, right? But now it kind of all makes sense where every other character is just getting boosted. Now, that said, if you're fighting like, say, Deep Delves and those bosses in particular, then, you know, I would actually put these classes a little bit higher on the list in terms of fighting with a group, even though I just said we're not talking about fighting with a group. So my point is that Neo Ninja will have its snare, which can be very, very helpful for everybody. I don't recall if Leviathans can even get snared, or if they can, it doesn't really matter because they just pull you in anyway, or at least the U10 one does. And Candy Barb is stronger than a D tier list. This is just focusing on it being a boss killer. Now, here's something very strange that we're gonna do, guys. For the Gunslinger, as of right now on the live server, it goes into the D list. But you'll note that on the test server right now, we actually have a Gunslinger rework on the way, which is actually making this class a B to A list for a boss killer. I'm still gonna throw the new Gunslinger into a B tier list just because it's not out yet. And so I don't know how strong it can end up being. I've heard reports from people that it's quite powerful, but for the meantime, let's just put it at the standard, like right in the middle. And then, you know, obviously this tier list is going to age when the Gunslinger update ends up coming out, and maybe everyone will just be like, oh my god, it totally belongs on an S tier list or something. But it remains to be seen because it is the test server, so there's a lot of fluctuation with the stats. Draco's another one of those characters I gotta put into the C tier list. It's got good damage, but most of all, the reason why it's actually a really good boss killer is because it has survivability. But for today's purposes, we're talking about dishing out damage, killing that boss as quickly as possible. And that's where Draco's kind of, you know, the tortoise and the hare, the slow and steady wins the race kind of thing, right? It's not going to end up defeating bosses particularly fast. It's more so that it will be able to outlast most bosses that you end up fighting, which in a Leviathan's case is not great because it's on a time limit. Now, Boomeranger mains, correct me if I'm wrong, but if I'm not mistaken, Boomer belongs in an A tier list as a boss killer right now, right? Like, I see a lot of people use Boomeranger on Leviathan, and I don't think it's just because it's their favorite class. It's most of all because all of the crazy abilities that you can get in the urn, like, here's the thing. Boomer can either be A list or D list, because the problem with the class is that so much of its abilities are based on RNG. So it's very, very random whether or not you're going to end up getting all the best abilities to stack on top of each other. If they do, Boomeranger is God tier. He just destroys things. But you gotta actually get lucky enough to get all of those abilities to trigger. Tomb Raiser, I guess I'm gonna put into a C tier list again. It's very, very similar to the Draco. Unfortunately, the Tomb Raiser has actually had some slight nerfs while Draco has been buffed, which is odd because in my opinion, both of these classes were very top tier in terms of being tanks as well as damage dealers. As far as a boss killer is concerned, Tomb Raiser is basically the exact same thing. Slow and steady wins the race because Tomb Raiser is basically invincible. And even though you actually do end up having a decent amount of damage when you have all of your skeletal babies, similar to the Draco's babies, it's going to do a lot of damage when all of them are summoned. But the point is that most classes will already just be dealing max damage immediately and don't have to have that initial startup time. That's why I'm putting them lower on the list. The Revenant. You know, fun fact, Revenant was one of the classes that could just tank anything back in the day. And I remember distinctly, either it was me or Merc back when he used to play Trove, where we ended up, I think we ended up making a video, or he made a video or something of soloing Ultra Dread with the Revenant, and it was really difficult to do at the time, so it was really impressive. But unfortunately, Shadow Tower is not what it once was. It basically doesn't exist anymore. And the Revenant, though very, very good in, like, I don't know, it's a decent class for delves, it's decent for everything, and the damage is really good. But I wouldn't necessarily say it's a Leviathan killer. Like, it can end up handling delve bosses fairly decently, but it's kind of another one of those classes that, in my opinion anyways, fits down here. But I guess, you know what? That's just talking about being a Leviathan killer, but we are also including delve bosses. So it actually is going to end up getting bumped up, because with Spirit Spears and then spamming your left click, Revenant actually has a pretty decent amount of damage, and also has a lot of life leech on top of the fact that we can get life leech in the skill tree right now. I mean, some people might disagree with this, but again, you can sound off in the comments if you think one class belongs either higher or lower on the list. But I don't think anyone's gonna disagree with the Lunar Lancer being bottom. You know, Lancer is a fantastic speed farmer, can end up handling dungeons fairly well, but when it comes to fighting bosses, it just kind of falls apart at the seams, right? Like, all of the abilities kind of complement speed and, you know, going fast and quick bursts of damage, which doesn't really help much when you're fighting a boss that requires you to quite literally be sitting there dealing the maximum amount of damage at all times. And then even though everyone's kind of moved on from the Chloromancer, Chloromancer is still S tier. So for those of you that don't know, the trick that people would end up doing with Chloromancer and why people were maining it for Leviathans for a short stint was that if you ended up throwing down your flowers with a far enough spread, like far enough distance apart, then they wouldn't delete each other when you would throw them down. Now, a lot has changed more recently. The Chloromancer ended up getting a huge nerf by, I think they ended up making it so that that just doesn't work anymore, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the Chloromancer doesn't still have heaps and heaps of damage. And I've also heard reports from a lot of you guys and gals that the Chloromancer can still kind of do that trick. It's just a little bit more complicated. Like, if I was to talk about the Chloromancer as a boss killer in terms of ease of use, it would be like way down here, just because it's really, really complicated in order to end up using the Chloromancer effectively on bosses. But I personally would still consider it to be way up there. Draco's another one of those weirdos where I would say, kind of the same as the Knight, it belongs in C or B tier. I'm going to throw it into the B tier just because I personally think that it handles bosses a little bit better than the Knight. More so because the way that the Draco works is you basically just throw your net down and then you jump in the air like a freak, shooting down on the enemy. And that was something that I still very fondly remember using the Draco very, very effectively to get through Shadow Towers, because it was just basically a gauntlet of enemies, and the fact that you could just stay jumped in the air meant that you would be invulnerable to most attacks. But the net also will snare. It doesn't snare Leviathans as far as I recall, but it's been a while since I ended up fighting a Leviathan with the Draco. But in terms of a delve boss, hey, it's no problem because it's going to snare it and then it's going to end up dealing heaps and heaps of damage. Also, this is probably going to bruise a lot of your egos because I see so many people try to use the Vanguard whenever we're fighting Leviathans, but what are you guys doing? Like, don't get me wrong. If you like the Vanguard, it's one of your favorite classes, that's fine. But what are you doing fighting Leviathans with the Vanguard, man? Like, no, especially because so many people will end up using ranged mode when they're fighting Leviathans and Delve bosses, when all of the damage is in the melee mode for Vanguard, and even then it just doesn't keep up with other classes, because most of the damage that you have is the burst of right click spamming your laser until you're out of energy, and then you're kind of useless until you regenerate more. Bard's a weird one. Bard's actually a very, very weird one. I would say C or B, but I'm gonna throw it into C, excuse me, because Bard is one of those classes that, again, people will end up using it for support, and it does actually have a very, very decent amount of damage. It's just, I don't really see anybody using the Bard for boss killing. Like, I see people using it effectively for speed farming and for handling groups of Delve enemies and dungeons, but when it comes to bosses themselves, I just don't really see people using it. Now, that said, I'm sure I'm gonna get a lot of slack for this, because as far as I recall, when the Bard ended up coming out, people were using it to effectively solo Leviathans. So again, people are probably gonna be like, what are you talking about? Why does it belong so low on the list? It should be way up there. But just in terms of the way that I'm gonna be real with you guys, I haven't really tried to use the Bard myself to solo Leviathans since it originally ended up coming out, like all that time ago. And so my view of it might be a little askew, because I'm just basing this off of the fact that I never see people use Bard on Leviathans or in Delves in general. I mean, I know it's also just because the class is a weirdo, and so there are Bard mains out there, there's just not many of you guys out there, right? So anyways, you can sound off in the comments if you completely disagree. But the funny thing is, I don't think anyone's gonna disagree with this, where the Solarion belongs in the S tier. I mean, honestly, if I could edit this list, Solarion would be SS tier. Like, it stands, is that what this up arrow does? No, that's just moving the list up and down. So the thing is, Solarion is without a doubt the strongest boss killer in the entire game right now. No question, there's not really any reason to use any other class for a boss killer. Like, legit, this guy belongs in SS tier, like all on its own. I just don't know how to adjust and add like a new tier to this list. But rest assured, Solarion would end up belonging right at the top, because it has insane amounts of damage. It hasn't been nerfed yet. I don't know if it's ever going to. Frankly speaking, I think that they should just buff up all the other characters so that they end up being equivalent. But I think that it's fair, because when you think about it, the Solarion is one of the hardest classes in the game to get, and it would be kind of a letdown if you would end up getting the class and then finding out that it just isn't really comparable to some of the other characters. And so that is my reason behind, okay, this must be the justification that the devs ended up having, why it's just so god tier and why they haven't brought it down. But anyways, that's my 2 cents towards the strongest class in the game. This is including Leviathan bosses and Delve bosses specifically. Not talking about Delves, not talking about survivability or anything. Most of all, just talking about that outburst of damage and just raw power. So let me know what you guys think. Sound off in the comments. Do you disagree with the list? Do you think certain characters belong higher or lower on the list? Also, if you have other tier list suggestions, I'm open to them. I've got already a very, very large list of suggestions from you guys. But yeah, I wanted to have this as a special surprise video just because of the fact that I ended up kind of taking the weekend off. I am going to be doing a lot of streams today, but as soon as I get this video up, I gotta have some breakfast and then I'll end up doing some streams and stuff. Anyways, love you guys and hope you had fun with today's video, because that's most of all what this is always about. You can buy the merch you want to support the channel, and have a wonderful day, everybody.